All right, next we're going to talk about glands. So glands are also accessory structures of the integumentary system, so they help aid in the overall function of the integumentary system. These are all so the glands we're about to talk about, they're all examples of exocrine glands. So exocrine glands, they are glands that produce a secretion that will go to the outside, okay? These secretory products go to the outside via ducts of glands, right? There are two major types of glands that we're going to talk about. Sweat glands that produce sweat or a modified type of sweat, and then sebaceous glands which produce an oily, lipid-rich sebum product, okay? So first, the first type of sweat gland we're going to talk about are when you think of sweat and the function of sweat with cooling and body temperature regulation, what you're thinking about are like true sweat glands called eccrine sweat glands, all right? So when you think about sweating and the function of sweating, you're most likely thinking about eccrine sweat glands. So if I look over here, this is a section through thin skin. I know that because I see hair follicle with the hair root and the hair shaft. Remember, when we see thick skin, we don't see hair follicles. This is thin skin, and we can see there are two glands here. They are both simple, tubular, coiled glands, so they look somewhat identical, but if you follow the duct of this gland, you can see that it empties into a hair follicle. Whereas if you follow the duct of this, so the duct of this gland, you can see that its duct leads to a pore of this on the surface of the epidermis, and it is not emptying into a hair follicle. This guy right here, not associated with a hair follicle, but is simple tubular coiled gland, this is an eccrine sweat gland. And if you were to take a cross section through any portion of this gland, you would see simple cuboidal epithelium. Remember, when you think simple cuboidal epithelium, you think, well, kidney tubules, yes, but you also think ducts of glands, all right? And what's the primary function of simple cuboidal epithelium? It's to produce a secretory product. Now, it can be involved in some absorption as well, like if we see in the kidneys, but the primary function is producing a secretion, right? So simple cuboidal epithelium. Now, glandular tissue is derived from epidermal cells. So when we talk about these glands, they're all derived from epidermal cells, but these epidermal cells in these glands aren't producing keratinocytes like what we talked about in nails and hairs and in the epidermis. These epidermal cells are they look more like the stratum basale layer, which if you remember the stratum basale layer, those cells look somewhat cuboidal, and that's because they're actively undergoing mitosis. They're very metabolically active, so they take on a cuboidal shape. Well, these epidermal cells are specialized to create a secretory product, but they're very metabolically active. They're constantly producing secretions, and so they are cuboidal. They're simple cuboidal. Here's the lumen of this glandular duct. The secretions go into this lumen, all right? And if we're talking about, so an eccrine sweat gland, the duct of this gland exits through a sweat pore on the surface of the epidermis, so its product gets released to the surface of the epidermis. And the secretion of an eccrine sweat gland is primarily water, and then it also contains some waste products like lactic acid, as well as some electrolytes. And so it does play a small role in excretion, because you can find, depending on the body state, the body can get rid of, if we have too many electrolytes, we can get rid of some of them via sweat. If we have waste products like lactic acid, we can get rid of it via these eccrine sweat glands. So it does play a small role in excretion. It also plays a small role in protection against microorganisms, bad microorganisms, so pathogens. because the sweat also can contain some antimicrobial substances that helps combat bad bacteria. The pH of sweat, it will be slightly acidic. That also helps limit the growth of bad bacteria on our skin. So ecrine sweat glands play a minor role in excretion as well as protection against microorganisms. But when you think about the main primary function of ecrine sweat glands, it's going to be body temperature regulation, but through a very specific method called evaporative cooling. The fact that this sweat is primarily 99% water, when sweat gets released, so when body temperature increases to a certain point, sweat glands can be stimulated to secrete sweat. That water lines the surface of the epidermis, and as long as there's a gradient for this water to evaporate, so, and I say gradient, like we live in Louisiana, and a lot of times it's super humid, and what is humidity? It's the moisture content of the air around us. And that's why when we sweat down here in Louisiana, a lot of times the sweat just stays on our skin. It doesn't evaporate off, and it's because the moisture in the air is too high. There's no gradient for that water to want to evaporate. But if you live in more arid, drier climates, what happens is the sweat gets released to the outside, then that water evaporates off of our skin, and when it evaporates, it pulls hot air that surrounds our skin. It pulls hot air with it. And when it pulls that hot air with it during evaporation, it cools off the surface of our skin. So ecrine sweat glands function primarily in body temperature regulation through evaporative cooling, all right? So now we've talked about the structure, we've talked about the location, and we talked about the primary function. You should know that. Apocrine sweat glands are those simple tubular coiled glands that look similar to ecrine sweat glands, but they are associated with a hair follicle. So over here, this would be an ecrine sweat gland. Here, we follow the duct. Its product will be released into a hair follicle. So this is an apocrine sweat gland. So apocrine sweat glands are found associated with hair follicles. And they're primarily located in areas of the body such as the axillae, so this armpit region, anal region, areola, this is the darker region around the nipple, and then also the groin. So these areas are where we find abundant apocrine sweat glands. Now, its product will also be a liquid type product, but it's very rich in proteins. And the fact that it's so protein rich, that is what causes the secretion to become odoriferous. Odoriferous means it has an odor. The sweat itself doesn't have an odor, but when it gets released to the surface of the skin, so here, this would be the apocrine sweat that gets released, protein rich, we have bacteria on our skin. Good bacteria. We need it there. It's good for us to be there. But the bacteria can metabolize that protein that gets secreted by the apocrine sweat glands. And when the bacteria metabolize the proteins, they produce this odor. So that's where the odor comes from. It comes from the bacteria metabolizing the proteins in the sweat, and then it releases an odor. Okay. Now, what is the function? Like, why do we have apocrine sweat glands if they produce an odor? So think of these guys as more of like they're pheromone producers. When not so much humans, like, when we think of humans, we don't really think of humans as being attracted to a particular, scent. But in a lot of mammals, pheromones, or that odor, is what attracts mates. It's what alerts predators or prey to, their surroundings and what might be located. It also this particular secretion can act as a territorial marker, right? So I've been here, this is mine, okay? But that's what, these odoriferous sweat glands, they aid in pheromone attraction as well as territorial markers. They become active after the onset of puberty. So that's why when you yourself, or if you have children that are entering into puberty, they may become a little stinky, and that's because these apocrine sweat glands are becoming more active at that time. When you think of emotional sweating, so we all know the difference between I'm sweating because I'm exercising and I'm sweating because I have anxiety, stress, fear, pain, or sexual stimulation, right? There's a different type of like evaporative cooling sweating versus emotional sweating. The emotional sweating comes from those apocrine sweat glands that are released into this the hair follicle. All right, so those are apocrine sweat glands. This is a histology image of both apocrine sweat glands and ecrine sweat glands. So apocrine and ecrine. Again, they look very similar on a histology slide, and that's because they're both simple tubular coiled glands made up of simple cuboidal epithelium. So we're going to quickly talk about the other two types of sweat glands, ceruminous and mammary. Ceruminous glands are modified apocrine glands that are found in the ear canal, and they produce a thick secretion called cerumen. And common term is earwax. And the function of this secretion is to help lubricate the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane is your eardrum. It needs to be lubricated so that sound waves can stimulate it effectively. It also, because it's thick and sticky, cerumen it lines the ear canal, and it can actually trap unwanted dust, debris, and microorganisms from getting down into our inner ear. If you've ever had an inner ear infection, you know that that's not fun. All right, so that's the function of cerumen produced by ceruminous glands that line the ear canal. Mammary glands are also a modified sweat gland. They're very highly specialized sweat glands, and their modified sweat secretion is actually called milk, okay? And you find mammary glands in mammary tissue of the breasts. And these are stimulated to produce their secretions upon birth. When a woman gives birth to a child, these glands are then stimulated to produce their secretion. But all of these glands, you will find simple cuboidal epithelium. Now, sebaceous glands. So sebaceous glands, we'll talk about, let's see. Okay, so here, sebaceous glands are also associated with hair follicles, but their structure is different. So when we saw apocrine sweat glands, they're simple tubular coiled in structure, whereas sebaceous glands, which are also associated with a hair follicle, have this acini structure. And remember, I didn't say that you needed to learn all of the glandular tissue structures, but I did mention when you think of acini is clusters of grapes. So we don't see that coiled tubular shape, but we still see what type of epithelium is this? This is simple cuboidal epithelium, but it's in the structure of acini, so grape-like clusters of glands, all right? Now, if we look at a histology slide of sebaceous glands down here, these are all cells of sebaceous glands, and they look kind of like, the first thing you should think of is looking at the sebaceous gland is adipose. Like, oh, it kind of looks like adipose-ish. Not really, but kinda. And that's because of the type of secretion that sebaceous glands produce. They produce a waxy, oily mixture, mainly lipids. And so a lot of times when you see lipids on a histology slide, it will be white or transparent in color, okay? So it's an oily secretion, and we call this oily secretion sebum, all right? Now we find, again, sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles, and we find them everywhere in the body except for the palms of our hands and soles of our feet. Why? Well, palms of hands, soles of feet, that's thick skin. Remember, what do we not find in thick skin? We don't find hair follicles. Well, sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles. So if we don't have hair follicles somewhere, we're not going to have sebaceous glands there. And then the greatest number of sebaceous glands will be on the face and the scalp. All right? Again, because associated with hair follicles. All around our face, we have very fine hair. On our scalp, we have thicker, coarser, pigmented hair. Let's see, what else do you need? What do you need to know about? Okay, so the function of this sebum. So the secretion is this waxy, oily, lipid-rich sebum that gets secreted. It's associated with a hair follicle, so guess what? This oily substance helps coat the hair and provides it with a hydrophobic barrier. Lipids are hydrophobic. It inhibits water loss. This is one of the reasons why if you wash your hair too much, your hair can dry out. It's because the more you wash your hair, you remove this hydrophobic barrier that this sebum provides, and then you lose more water and your hair gets drier, right? So that's why if you wash your hair too much, it's bad. So it provides this hydrophobic barrier. It also helps lubricate the hair shaft. The sebum will coat the surface of the skin, providing a hydrophobic barrier to the skin, as well as it provides a moist environment. It inhibits water loss of the skin as well, and provides a moist, lubricated environment to the skin. We know if our skin gets too dry, it cracks. When it cracks, we now become prone to bacterial infection, and that's not good. So this sebum also helps lubricate not only our hair shafts, but helps lubricate and inhibit water loss of our skin as well. This bullet right here where it says it inhibits growth or kills certain bacteria, that comes from the fact that sebum also incorporates or has antimicrobial compounds as well as a slightly acidic pH. Those two things combined can help limit bad bacterial growth on our cell. Sebum lubricates, again, I've already mentioned this, it lubricates the skin, protects the skin against too much friction that could mean ruptures in the skin and more prone to bacterial infections. So that's the function of sebaceous glands. Again, it has that acini structure, that grape-like clusters, simple cuboidal epithelium still, and then the secretions are this really lipid-rich sebum, and you should know the functions of sebum. This is a histology slide through the skin, and it's just showing you, this would be, we see a single duct leading to the surface of the skin. It's not associated with the hair follicle, so this would be an ecrine sweat gland. Over here, so here, this is a hair follicle. This is a hair follicle. Look, it looks kind of like adipose, right? And it has that grape-like cluster structure appearance to it. These are sebaceous glands, and guess what? They're connected to a hair follicle. So that would be a sebaceous gland. All right. Some more accessory structures that we find in the integumentary system. We've already mentioned some of these nervous tissue structures, but let's talk about, let's just revisit the ones we've already discussed and then a new one that we haven't yet discussed. So Meissner's corpuscles, remember Meissner's corpuscles are found in the papillary layer of the dermis, more specifically within the dermal papillae. Meissner's corpuscles are going to help detect fine touch, discriminative touch, so distinguishing, shapes and textures, as well as very low frequency vibrations. It makes sense that it would be a fine touch receptor and low frequency vibrations because these are located more superficially in the papillary layer of the dermis. Merkel cells, we already talked about Merkel cells. These are actually modified epithelial cells. They're found in the stratum basale. They are also fine touch. They help discriminate textures and shapes as well. That makes sense because they are located actually within the epidermis, so more superficially, it'd be light touch and discriminative touch. Pacinian corpuscles, remember these are these large nervous tissue structures that are found deeper within the dermis. And the fact that they're larger and they're located deeper within the dermis, they're going to detect deep pressure. It's going to require a lot more pressure on the cutaneous membrane to stimulate these guys because they're located deeper within. So deep pressure receptors as well as high frequency vibrations, that's what this nervous tissue structure will pick up and sense. Ruffini endings, I don't think we've mentioned about these just yet. Ruffini endings are actually stretch receptors, and so as the skin stretches, these guys will be stimulated and send information to the nervous system about stretch. Free nerve endings, so here's a sensory neuron, and it has these free nerve endings that actually go up and throughout the epidermis. Free nerve endings will have a variety of different types of receptors on them, like thermoreceptors that will be able to detect extreme hot and cold, mechanoreceptors, which can that can be sensitive to like stretch and mechanical friction and abrasion of the skin, and then nociceptors, which pick up on detect noxious stimuli, so chemicals. These can be external chemicals or even chemicals that are released from cells that are broken open. So if there's damage to the epidermis, there are certain chemicals that get released by the keratinocytes, and these nociceptors can pick up on that, and that gives us information about pain and damage to the tissues. And so those are the nervous tissue structures that we find in the skin.